The morning Mary Bell walked into the Millhaven cattle auction with a single silver dollar in her coat pocket, and grief still carved fresh into the lines of her face. Not a soul in that dusty Colorado town expected the day to end any way other than ordinary. It was the autumn of 1878, and Millhaven sat at the edge of the high plains like a stubborn splinter caught in the heel of the Rockies, small enough that everyone knew your name, large enough that people could still hurt you in ways you never saw coming. The auction yard smelled of manure and sawdust, and the particular kind of desperation that settles over a place when the summer rains have been thin and the cattle prices thinner. Men in worn hats leaned against fence posts and traded rumors, the way other men traded currency, and the auctioneer's voice cracked through the cold air like a whip. Mary Bell was 31 years old, with dark brown hair pinned severely beneath a faded black bonnet, and eyes the color of creek water after a storm gray-green, and carrying too much weight for their natural beauty to fully escape. She had been widowed 9 months prior when her husband, Thomas Bell, had died of a fever that started in his lungs and worked its way through the rest of him with a thoroughness that left her alone on 40 acres of rocky Colorado soil with 2 children, a broken-down plow horse, and a cattle operation that had never truly been an operation at all, just Thomas's ambition wearing the costume of one. Thomas had been a good man. Mary had loved him honestly, and she missed him every single morning when the silence of the house pressed against her before the children woke. But Thomas had died owing money to the Millhaven Territorial Bank, and the bank, managed by a thin-lipped man named Gerald Hooper who wore a cravat in the middle of cattle country like it was a declaration of war, had made it abundantly clear that if Mary Bell did not demonstrate some manner of viable livestock production by the 1st of November, the loan on the farm would be called, and she would lose the land. She had 43 days. She had $1 silver. She had come to the auction because old Pete Calloway, who ran the feed store and had known Thomas since boyhood, had told her 3 nights prior over a cup of coffee at his store counter that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a man would bring a bull to auction that nobody wanted. A bull too old to be fashionable, too ornery to be popular, but sound enough in his bones and vital enough in his purpose that a small operation could use him to build a herd from the inside out. Breed him to whatever cows you could scrape together, build your stock slowly, sell calves by spring. It was the only plan that made any logical sense given what she had, which was very nearly nothing. What Pete had not told her was that the auction would be packed wall-to-fence post with men who treated her arrival like a spectacle. She felt their eyes when she pushed through the gate. Some were merely curious. A widow alone at a cattle auction was not a common sight in 1878 Colorado. Some were dismissive, the kind of men who looked at a woman standing in a man's world and saw only the incongruity rather than the person. A few were worse, wearing smiles that did not belong on their faces, the kind that said they thought her situation was somehow an opportunity for them. Mary kept her chin level and her eyes forward and walked to the rail. The auction began with calves, then heifers, then a string of young steers that went for prices she could not have touched even if she had sold the coat off her back. She watched the numbers climb and felt the single coin in her pocket with a growing sense of something between foolishness and fury. What had she been thinking? $1 at a cattle auction in 1878 was not a bid. It was almost an insult. She was preparing to leave, telling herself she would figure something else out on the long walk home, would think of another plan, would not cry until she was past the edge of town where no one could see, when the auctioneer's assistant led a bull into the ring. The animal was a Hereford, red-bodied with a white face, and he was not young. He had probably seen 6 or 7 years of Colorado winters, which showed in the deliberate, heavy way he moved. He was not broken, not even close, and he demonstrated that immediately by planting his hooves in the center of the ring and staring at the assembled crowd with an expression of such complete contempt that several men along the rail actually stepped back. He was large. He was proud. He was in no way interested in the proceedings around him. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Cal Dewey with a voice like a steam engine, started the bidding at $5. Nothing. He dropped to 3. Silence. He sighed with the theatrical disappointment of a man who had seen this before and dropped to $1. One voice, Mary Bell's, said, $1. The assembled men turned to look at her. Cal Dewey peered over his podium. Even the bull seemed to consider her with some new attention. "Lady," Cal Dewey said carefully, "this here is Absalom. He has broken 3 fence posts, 2 men's fingers, and the patience of every rancher between here and Pueblo who's tried to work him." $1, Mary said again, her voice steady in a way her insides were not. A pause stretched long enough to have its own weather. "Sold," said Cal Dewey, with a note in his voice that suggested he considered this either the most interesting thing that had happened all week or the most foolish. The men along the rail laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Mary heard the particular quality of that laughter and felt it land on her like cold water, but she kept her expression even and walked to pay her $1, which she handed over with both hands because she did not want anyone to see that only one of them was entirely steady. It was while she was completing the transaction that she first truly noticed Edgar Langston. He had been standing somewhat apart from the main crowd, near the corner of the auction pen, and he was not laughing. He was watching her with an expression she could not immediately categorize, not pity, which she would have resented, and not amusement, which she would have resented more. It was something more like assessment, the way a man looks at something he is genuinely trying to understand. Edgar Langston was 34 years old, though he wore it in the manner of a man who had spent those years outdoors and working, which meant he looked capable rather than old. He was tall with the kind of build that comes from actual labor rather than any particular vanity about it, broad through the shoulders, narrow through the hip, with large hands that were visibly calloused even from a distance. His hat was dark brown and not new. His coat was canvas and practical. He had dark eyes beneath a straight brow and a jaw that had clearly gone unshaved for several days, not from carelessness, but from the simple fact that shaving requires time, and time was a commodity that working men rarely had in surplus. He was, Mary would later think, exactly what he was, nothing performed, nothing ornamented. Just a man who existed fully in whatever space he occupied. She did not think any of that in the moment, of course. In the moment, she thought, he is staring at me, and I have just spent my last coin on a bull named Absalom, and I need to figure out how to get this animal home. That was the second problem she had not fully calculated. She had no wagon. She had walked the 4 miles from her farm to Millhaven that morning, as she did most days since the plow horse, whose name was Colonel and who was 20 years old and deserved his retirement, could not reasonably be ridden and was certainly not capable of pulling anything. She had assumed, and she could see now what a foolish assumption it had been, that she would somehow manage to lead a bull 4 miles across open Colorado prairie on a rope. She was standing beside Absalom's temporary pen, looking at the bull, and the bull was looking back at her with that magnificent contempt, when she heard boots on the ground beside her and looked up. "That's a decent bull," Edgar Langston said. His voice was low and straightforward, not unkind. "Under all that attitude." "I can see that," Mary said, because she could. The animal's frame was good, his conformation solid. Under the orneriness was a sound, vital creature. "You have a way to get him home?" Edgar asked. Mary considered lying. She was not naturally a prideful woman, but 9 months of widowhood and Gerald Hooper's cravat and men laughing at her dollar bid had done something to her reserves of easy humility. "I'm working on it," she said. Edgar looked at her for a moment, then at the bull, then back at her. "I've got a wagon," he said, "and a stock gate on it. I'm heading south out of town." "Where's your place?" Mary told him. "That's on my way," he said simply. It was not, as she would discover later, entirely on his way. But she did not know that yet. They loaded Absalom into the back of Edgar's wagon with considerably more difficulty than the phrase implies. The bull objected to the ramp. He objected to the wagon bed. He objected, it seemed, to the entire concept of being transported by another creature's arrangement, and he communicated these objections physically and with great enthusiasm. It took Edgar, Mary, and the auctioneer's assistant nearly 20 minutes and a length of good rope to accomplish the task, and by the end of it, Edgar's hat had been knocked off twice, and Mary had lost the composure she had been holding so carefully all morning, and had begun laughing, real laughing, surprised laughing, the kind that comes up from somewhere deep in a person and cannot be planned or performed. Edgar, retrieving his hat from the dirt for the second time, looked over at her laughing, and something happened in his face that he immediately arranged back into neutrality, but not quite quickly enough. There had been something warm there, something that had caught the light. Absalom, Mary said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, is an excellent name for him. He's got the pride for it, Edgar agreed, settling his hat back on his head, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way that suggested a smile without quite committing to one. They climbed onto the wagon bench, Mary on the right, Edgar on the left with the reins, and the two draft horses Edgar drove pulled them out of the auction yard and into the wide, cold afternoon. The sky over the Rockies to the west had gone the color of pewter, and the aspens along the creek line had shed most of their gold by now, leaving their white trunks bare and bright against the dark pines. It was the kind of Colorado afternoon that was purely, specifically beautiful in a way that did not care at all about anything happening beneath it, which Mary had always found either comforting or exasperating, depending on the state of her heart. "I'm Mary Bell," she said, when the town was behind them and the silence had settled into something that required an acknowledgement. "Edgar Langston," he said. "I've got the Langston flat out south of the creek, about 6 miles past your place." She had heard of it. Thomas had mentioned it, a cattle operation of maybe 300 head, well managed, one of the better small ranches in the county. She had not known who ran it, or rather, she had never had occasion to put a face to the name. "You've been ranching out here long?" she asked, because conversation seemed preferable to the alternative, which was sitting in silence with a stranger on a wagon bench while a philosophical bull expressed his opinions from the wagon bed behind them. 7 years, Edgar said. "Came out from Ohio. Had a notion that the high plains would suit me better than the river valley and turned out to be right about that." "Ohio," Mary said. "I'm from Tennessee originally. Thomas, my husband, was from Missouri. We came out here 6 years ago." A brief pause. "I was sorry to hear about Thomas Bell," Edgar said, and she believed him because there was nothing in his voice to suggest otherwise. "Thank you," she said quietly, and meant it with the simple dignity of a woman who had said those 2 words many hundreds of times in the past 9 months, and had learned to mean them every time, differently. They rode without talking for a while after that, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. The road was rutted, and the wagon rocked, and Absalom made periodic statements from the back, and the mountains stood enormous and quiet on the western horizon. Mary found herself relaxing by degrees, her hands loosening in her lap, the rigid posture she had been maintaining all morning softening into something more natural. "Can I ask you something?" Edgar said after they had traveled perhaps a mile. "You can ask," Mary said. "What are you planning to do with him, the bull? Do you have cows to breed him to?" It was a practical question and deserved a practical answer. "I have 4 cows," she said. 2 are Thomas's original stock and 2 I purchased last spring. I was hoping to build the herd from the inside calves by spring, sell them by summer. The bank has a deadline on the farm loan." Edgar was quiet for a moment, and she appreciated that he did not immediately offer advice or tell her what she should have done instead. "What's your pasture situation?" he asked. "The South 40 is good grass. The North Field is rocky, but it's fenced. That south pasture will work for him. He'll need his own space at first. You'll want to introduce him to the cows gradually or he'll run them ragged." Mary looked at him. "You know bulls." "I've made enough mistakes with them to have learned a few things, yes," Edgar said. She almost smiled. "What kind of mistakes?" And he told her, and she did smile. at the story of a young Hereford bull who had dismantled an entire section of fence in a single night and been found the next morning 3 miles away investigating a neighboring ranch's garden, and the negotiation with that neighbor that had followed, which had apparently involved a great deal of apologizing and a bottle of rye whiskey. Mary laughed again, and Edgar watched the road ahead, but she could see his jaw had relaxed, and the line of his shoulders was easier than it had been. When they reached the Bell farm, Edgar helped her unload Absalom into the south pasture with considerably less drama than the loading had involved, as though the bull had decided to grant them a temporary reprieve from his personality now that his surroundings were satisfactory. Mary's 2 children, Daniel, who was 8, and Clara, who was 5, came running from the direction of the house at the sound of the wagon and stopped dead at the sight of the bull. "Mama," Daniel said carefully, "is that a bull?" "That is Absalom," Mary said. "He is going to help us save the farm." Daniel looked at Absalom. Absalom looked at Daniel. Some manner of mutual evaluation occurred. "He's very big," Clara offered. "He is," Mary agreed. "Say hello to Mr. Langston, both of you. He helped me bring Absalom home." Both children said hello with the careful manners Mary had drilled into them, and Edgar crouched down to their level in a way that she noticed, a man who knew how to speak to children, who made himself smaller so they felt larger. He asked Daniel about the farm and Clara about the name she'd chosen for their plow horse, and both of them answered with the particular enthusiasm of children who are being genuinely addressed rather than performed at. Mary watched him and thought, "He is a good man." The thought arrived clean and simple, with no agenda attached to it, the way honest observations sometimes do. She offered him coffee before he left, because it was what you did, and because the afternoon had turned genuinely cold, and he accepted, which surprised her slightly. She had expected him to decline with a politeness that also served as an exit. Instead, he tied his horses at the post and came inside. The Bell farmhouse was small and plain and scrupulously clean. Mary kept it so partly out of pride, and partly because having things in order was one of the ways she managed the chaos of grief and circumstance. The kitchen smelled of the bread she had baked that morning, and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beam. A tin stove in the corner gave off real heat. Edgar sat at the kitchen table while Mary made coffee at the stove, and Daniel positioned himself immediately at Edgar's elbow to continue the conversation about the farm, which had now evolved to include an elaborate account of Colonel's recent behavior, and the time last spring when the plow had hit a rock and broken its handle. Edgar listened to all of it with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions at appropriate intervals, and Mary observed this from the corner of her eye while she ground the coffee and thought about nothing in particular with great concentration. He stayed for 1 cup of coffee. He declined a second. When he stood to leave, he turned his hat in his hands twice and then said, without looking directly at her, "If you have trouble with Absalom in the first few days settling him in, getting him introduced to the cows, I can come by. I've got experience with ornery Herefords." "I can manage," Mary said automatically. He looked at her then, and it was a direct, honest look without any challenge in it. "I know you can," he said. "The offer stands if you want it." He left. She heard the wagon creak out of the yard and stood at the kitchen window and watched the dust settle and told herself firmly that what she was feeling was simply gratitude, which was a perfectly appropriate thing to feel toward a man who had given her a wagon ride and good advice. Daniel appeared at her elbow. "I like him," he said with the blunt verdict passing of an 8-year-old. "Drink your water," Mary said, and went to check on the bread. The next 2 weeks were hard in the specific, practical way that farm life in 1878 was hard. Not dramatically, not with the sharp edges of crisis, but with the grinding, continuous demand of it. Mary was up before dawn every morning to check on the stock, to feed, to haul water from the creek when the trough froze overnight, to make breakfast for herself and the children, to oversee Daniel's lessons from the second-hand McGuffey reader that had come with the farm, to cook and mend and manage and think, always think, about what came next and how to make it work. Absalom settled into the south pasture with the air of a king who had been assigned a slightly smaller kingdom than expected, but was prepared to make it work. He was not friendly, but he was manageable, which was what Mary needed him to be. She introduced him to the cows gradually over the course of the first week, as Edgar had advised, and by the end of the second week, the natural order of things was establishing itself in the way that cattle, given appropriate circumstances, tend to establish order. She did not send for Edgar Langston. She thought about sending for him on the third day when Absalom broke the water trough with one well-placed kick, and she had to spend an entire afternoon patching it with the spare wood from the barn, while the temperature dropped, and Daniel handed her nails, and Clara sat on an upturned bucket and sang to herself. She thought about it again on the fifth day when one of the older cows developed a concerning cough, and she was not entirely certain whether it was serious or seasonal. She thought about it on the eighth day when she was up at 2 in the morning because she had heard something moving near the chicken coop and had gone out with the old Winchester and found nothing, and the emptiness of the yard and the cold of the night, and the weight of being the only adult responsible for everything pressed down on her so heavily that she stood for a while with her back against the barn wall and just breathed. She did not send for him, because she had told him she could manage, and she could manage. But on the 12th day, Edgar Langston came to her. He came in the late morning, riding a sturdy gray gelding, and he had a reason, which she suspected afterward was a manufactured reason, though it was a good one. He had a small sack of salt lick that he said he'd ordered too much of, and he knew she was building a herd and salt lick was useful. He presented this with a straightforwardness that dared her to find it anything other than what he said it was, and Mary was honest enough with herself to know that, whether it was an excuse or not, she was glad to see him. She showed him the south pasture, and he looked at Absalom and the cows, and said the introduction had gone well, and that the bull looked healthier than he had at auction, better quality grass here, he said, than what she'd seen with however the previous owner had been running him. He noticed the patched trough and said it was a good repair. He did not make a production of saying any of it, just noted it the way a person notes what is true. They walked the fence line together while Daniel trailed behind them, and Edgar pointed out 2 places where the posts were soft at the base and would need replacing before winter truly set in, or the whole section would fail. He offered to bring post materials when he had a chance in town. "You don't need to do that," Mary said. "I know," he said. She looked at him sideways. "Is this charity?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, and there was something in his expression that was very serious and very plain. "No," he said. "I help neighbors, that's different." She held his gaze for a moment, measuring the honesty she found there. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He came back 4 days later with the fence posts, and spent the afternoon sinking them while Mary worked nearby on mending harness leather that needed replacing. And they talked, properly talked, the kind of extended back-and-forth conversation that happens when 2 people are both busy with their hands, and the usual social pressure of direct engagement is lifted by the fact of the work. He told her about the Langston flat, about the herd he'd spent 7 years building from 20 head to 300, about the 2 ranch hands he employed, brothers named Amos and Pete Gruber, who were good workers and occasionally spectacular disasters. She told him about Tennessee, about how she and Thomas had met at a church social when she was 17 and he was 19, and the whole affair of their courtship had been so conventional and sweet that it seemed almost implausible in retrospect. She told him about the decision to come west, which had been Thomas's dream and which she had embraced because she loved him, and because she had her own private sense of adventure that simply expressed itself differently than his. "Do you regret coming?" Edgar asked. Mary thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "The land is beautiful, the children were born here, Thomas is buried here, this is where my life is." "Mine too," Edgar said, driving a post with a rhythm that was efficient and unhurried. "I couldn't go back east now. Something about this place, the size of it, the sky. Yes, Mary said simply, and they understood each other on that point without needing to say more. November arrived with cold that had teeth in it, and with it came Gerald Hooper from the Territorial Bank, arriving at her farm in his good wool coat and his cravat, which was dark blue today, and which still looked absurd and deliberate in the middle of the Colorado high plains. He came to inspect what he termed her operational progress, and he walked through the south pasture with the expression of a man who finds the physical reality of cattle slightly distasteful, and he looked at Absalom and the cows and asked her about her projected calf numbers for spring. Mary gave him the numbers, which were honest and not extravagant, and Hooper wrote them in his small leather notebook and said that the bank would review her situation again in January, at which point a determination would be made. What kind of determination? Mary asked. Whether the operation demonstrates sufficient viability to support the continuance of the existing loan agreement, Hooper said, in the particular way that bureaucratic men say things they could say plainly but prefer to say in a way that makes the power differential clear. After he left, Mary stood in the yard for a long moment, then went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put her hands flat on the wood, and thought through everything with the deliberate, careful logic that had gotten her this far. The numbers were real. The calves would come in spring. She had 3 months to demonstrate enough to satisfy a man who, she strongly suspected, had already made some manner of preliminary decision about her. She was still sitting there when Daniel came in from the barn where he'd been doing his afternoon chores, and immediately read her face with the perceptive accuracy of a child who has spent months learning the emotional weather of the only adult in his world. "Was it the bank man?" he asked. "Yes," Mary said. "Are we going to lose the farm?" She looked at her son, who was 8 years old and had Thomas's brown eyes and her own stubborn jaw. "No," she said. "We are not." She meant it. She had to mean it. She told Edgar about the visit the next time he came by, which was 2 days later. He listened without interrupting, leaning against the fence rail with his arms crossed and his eyes on the pasture while she laid out what Hooper had said and what it meant. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Hooper's been buying up land along the Southern Creek," he said finally. Mary looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean he's made offers on 3 farms in the last year. 2 of them took his offer after he called their loans. The third, old Garrison's place, Garrison held on because he had family money to back him." Edgar's voice was careful and even. "I'm not saying that's what's happening here, but it's worth knowing." The information settled over Mary with a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. She thought about Thomas's land, the south pasture, the creek access they had. Yes, creek access. That was worth something. That was worth a great deal. "He wants the water rights," she said. "Possibly," Edgar said. "Probably." "He's not getting my farm," Mary said, and the firmness in her voice surprised even her with its depth. This was Thomas's land. This was her children's home. This was the thing she had held on to through 9 months of grief and hardship, and no man in a city cravat was going to take it from her by calling a loan she was in the process of meeting. "No," Edgar agreed simply. "He's not." December came. The calves were still weeks away. Absalom had done his work in October, which meant the first calves would arrive in July or August of the following year, not in spring as she had originally hoped. She had miscalculated the timeline. It was a significant problem. She was working through the implications of this miscalculation on a December morning when Edgar arrived at the farm and found her in the south pasture with a piece of paper and a pencil, doing arithmetic in the margin while Absalom watched her with his customary skepticism. She explained the timeline problem. Edgar listened, then said, "Would the bank accept calves pledged rather than sold? A documented expectation rather than realized income?" "I don't know," Mary said. "Your neighbor 2 miles north, Mrs. Hayward, she has 2 heifers she's been trying to sell since August. Couldn't find a buyer at her price. If you could acquire them, even on credit, you'd have more cows to Absalom this season, more calves next summer." "I can't afford them," Mary said. "You might be able to trade," Edgar said. Mrs. Hayward has been wanting someone to put up a new section of her chicken coop for 2 winters. I could do the work if you agreed to supply her with eggs at a set rate through spring." Mary stared at him. "Why would you do her chicken coop?" He paused. "Because you need the heifers and because it's a reasonable trade," he said. "And because—" he stopped. "Because what?" she asked. He looked at her directly, and there was something in his expression she had been carefully not looking at for the past several weeks, the way you deliberately don't look directly at the sun even when you're very aware of where it is in the sky. "Because I want to help you," he said simply, "if you'll let me." The silence between them was different from the ones that had come before. This one had weight and texture and something that required a response. "Edgar," she said carefully. "I know," he said. "You can manage." "I can manage," she confirmed. "Yes," he said, "but you don't always have to do it alone." She looked out across the south pasture where Absalom stood in the winter-pale grass like a king surveying his slightly disappointing domain. She thought about 2 in the morning against the barn wall. She thought about the silence of the house before the children woke. She thought about Thomas, who she had loved, and about grief, which was not the same as loneliness even though it sometimes wore loneliness's face. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you, Edgar." And something shifted between them, subtle and enormous at the same time, the way a river changes course, not all at once, but undeniably. He negotiated the arrangement with Mrs. Hayward, a stout practical woman in her 60s, who accepted the terms with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had been managing a farm alone for 20 years and knew a good trade when she saw one. Edgar put up her chicken coop section in 2 days, working in the December cold with a steadiness that impressed even Mrs. Hayward, who was not easily impressed by anything. The 2 heifers came to the Bell farm on a Thursday, young and healthy, and Absalom, to everyone's relief, accepted their presence without dismantling anything. The weeks between December and Christmas were the strangest, and in some ways the most quietly beautiful of the past difficult year. Edgar came by the farm regularly. Not every day, not so often that it drew comment, but regularly, with the easy naturalness of someone who had become woven into the ordinary fabric of the place. He helped with the fence. He helped Daniel understand a section of arithmetic from the McGuffey reader that had defeated both of them for a week. He sat at the kitchen table and ate Mary's cooking, and said honest things about it that were neither flattery nor false modesty. Just the direct appreciation of a man who had been cooking for himself for 7 years and knew what good food was. Clara, who was 5 and had opinions that she expressed without censorship, announced one evening, as Edgar was leaving, that she thought he should stay for supper every night. Edgar had looked at Mary with an expression that was entirely helpless and entirely appealing, and Mary had said, "Clara, that is Mr. Langston's decision to make," and Edgar had said, "I appreciate the invitation very much," and Clara had said, "Good, then it's decided," with the ironclad logic of a 5-year-old, and Edgar had stayed for supper. Something happened that evening at the table that Mary thought about for a long time afterward. It was not dramatic. There was no moment of declaration or revelation. It was simply that at some point during the meal, while Edgar and Daniel were engaged in a serious discussion about whether Colonel the plow horse understood human language, Daniel argued yes. Edgar argued that Colonel understood human emotion rather than language, which was more sophisticated. Actually, Mary looked at the 3 of them at her table in the lamplight, and her heart did something that caught her completely off guard. It was not disloyal to Thomas. She knew that with a clarity that required no justification. Thomas had been Thomas, her first love, her children's father, a good and earnest man who had loved her as well as he knew how. But Thomas was gone, and the heart does not stop being a heart simply because it has been broken. She did not say anything. She passed the biscuits and made sure everyone had enough and kept her expression exactly as it had been. But she knew. Christmas that year was a modest affair in the Bell house, as it had been since Thomas died. She had set aside a small amount from the egg sales to buy Daniel a new book, and Clara a cloth doll with a painted face from the dry goods store in Millhaven. She made a proper Christmas dinner, roast chicken and sweet potatoes, and a dried apple pie, because the apple tree out back of the house still gave well even though everything else had been difficult. She had not expected Edgar to come on Christmas Day. She had not invited him because it had seemed presumptuous to assume he had no other plans, no family of his own to spend the day with. But in the late morning, when she was elbow-deep in the apple pie preparation, she heard a horse in the yard and looked out the kitchen window and felt something she was no longer pretending not to feel. He came to the door with his hat in his hand and a wrapped parcel that turned out to contain, for Daniel, a good quality pocket knife with a bone handle, and for Clara, a small tin of colored pencils that had come from the dry goods store in Pueblo and were not easy to find in Millhaven. For Mary, he had brought a book, a novel actually, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Brontë in a clean cloth-bound copy that he must have ordered specially because she had mentioned, weeks ago in passing, that she had wanted to read it ever since Thomas had come home from town one day, and described seeing it in the window of a bookshop, and said he'd meant to buy it for her but never quite gotten around to it. She stood holding the book and looked at him and was unable to arrange her face into its usual careful composure. "You remembered that," she said. "Yes," he said. "Edgar, Merry Christmas, Mary," he said gently. She set the book down carefully on the table and did something she had not done in 9 months in front of another adult. She put her hand briefly over her eyes and just breathed for a moment. When she took her hand away, her eyes were bright but she was composed. "Stay for dinner," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said, without hesitation. They ate together, all 4 of them, in the warm lamplight of the Bell kitchen, while the snow that had been threatening all week finally began to fall outside the windows in the large, slow, dramatic flakes that turn everything soft and white and new. Daniel showed Edgar the pocket knife with the reverence of an 8-year-old who has been given exactly the right thing. Clara arranged her colored pencils by color on the table, and then drew a picture of Absalom that captured his general attitude of superiority with surprising accuracy. After dinner, when the children were drowsy and the dishes were done, Mary and Edgar sat on the 2 chairs by the stove with coffee cups and the comfortable silence of people who have passed the point of needing to fill every moment with words. The fire shifted in the stove. Outside, the snow continued to fall. "Do you have family in Ohio?" Mary asked. "A sister," Edgar said. "She's married and settled there. We write occasionally." A pause. "My parents passed some years ago. It's been just me for a while." "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked. She was not sure why she asked it. The question seemed to arrive from some honest, unguarded place before her more careful self could intercept it. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "Sometimes," he said. "Less recently." She did not ask him what he meant. She did not need to. January came with a cold that was earnest and unapologetic. Hooper from the bank made another inspection visit, this one more thorough than the first, and he walked the entire property with his notebook while Mary walked beside him and provided exactly the information required and nothing additional. He asked about the new heifers. She saw him register them, and she explained the arrangement with Mrs. Hayward without mentioning Edgar, because she suspected Hooper would find some way to use that information, and she was not going to give him anything he hadn't earned. When Hooper had finished his inspection and was preparing to leave, he paused beside his horse with a manner that Mary immediately recognized as the preparatory posture of someone about to make an offer they have been sitting on. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "I want you to know that the bank is prepared to be reasonable in all of this. If the farm circumstances continue to be challenging, there are options. The bank has certain interests in this area, and there may be arrangements that could benefit both parties." "What kind of arrangements?" Mary said in a tone of perfect neutrality. "The bank could acquire the property at a fair valuation. You would be released from the loan obligations entirely, and you and your children would have—" "No," Mary said. He blinked. "Mrs. Bell, if you'd let me." "No," she said again, with the same absolute, uncomplicated finality. "Thank you for your visit, Mr. Hooper. I'll look for your written review of the inspection." He left, and Mary watched him go. And then she went directly to the south pasture and stood at the fence and looked at Absalom and the cows and the 2 new heifers, and she felt something very fierce and very clean moving through her. She wrote to Edgar that evening, a letter, because she did not want to wait for him to come by, and because putting things on paper was how she thought most clearly. She told him what Hooper had said and what she had said in return, and that she was going to need to move faster on the numbers, and that she had an idea about selling some of the current stock before winter fully broke. Not Absalom, never Absalom, but perhaps 2 of the older cows at the current cattle price, if she could find a buyer before the spring auction flood brought prices down. Edgar came the next morning, earlier than she'd expected, and he had clearly read her letter more than once because he had notes in response, practical, useful, detailed thoughts about timing and pricing, and 2 possible buyers he knew personally, men who ran operations farther south and were always in need of reliable older breeding stock. He had thought it through for her, but he presented his thoughts as information rather than instruction, laying them out and stepping back, making it entirely clear that what she chose to do with them was hers. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. "I wanted to," he said. She looked at him across the kitchen table, with his notes and his honest face, and decided that there was no longer any useful purpose in pretending she did not know what she felt. It had been building since the auction yard, since the wagon ride, since Christmas, since every ordinary morning and practical conversation and moment of help offered without price or agenda. She was not a woman who had ever been comfortable with pretense, and maintaining this particular pretense had become an effort she was less and less willing to make. "Edgar," she said. "Yes," he said, and the way he said it suggested he had been waiting for something, had known something was coming, had been patient. "I would like to know what your intentions are," she said plainly. He was absolutely still for a moment, and then he exhaled slowly and set down his notes and looked at her with the full direct quality of his attention, which was considerable. "My intentions," he said carefully, "are whatever you want them to be. I won't push you. You've been through a great deal this past year, and your situation has required everything from you. I don't want to add to your burdens." "You are not a burden," she said. "Mary, you have been the opposite of a burden for 3 months," she said steadily. You have been very important to me, to us. And I believe you know that I am not a woman who says things she does not mean." He held her gaze for a long, serious moment. "No," he said, "you are not. Then I am telling you plainly that I would like to know if what I have been feeling is something you share or something I have constructed from gratitude." He stood up from the table so suddenly that his chair scraped back against the floor, and he crossed to her side of the table and then stopped himself, very deliberately, 3 feet away from her, with the look of a man who was exercising significant restraint. "It is not gratitude," he said. "What I feel is not Mary. I drove 6 miles out of my way the day of the auction because I could not watch you walk 4 miles home alone with that dollar's worth of trouble. I have not spent this much time at anyone's farm in 7 years. I have thought about—" He stopped. He was not a man of easy speeches or comfortable declarations. "I think about you constantly," he said finally, in a voice that was lower and more stripped of everything but honesty than anything she had heard from him before. "I think about you and your children and this farm, and whether you're warm enough, and whether the bank is going to be a problem, and whether—" He stopped again. "Whether what?" she asked softly. "Whether you might ever want someone again, after Thomas." The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove breathed steadily. Outside, the January cold pressed against the windows. Mary stood up from her chair. She was a practical woman who had managed 9 months of grief and hardship and threat without asking anyone for anything she wasn't prepared to offer in return. She was also, beneath all of that, A woman with a whole and feeling heart that had recognized something real when it stood across a kitchen table from her. She crossed the 3 feet between them and took his hand in both of hers, his large, calloused, honest hand, and held it. "Yes," she said simply. "I do." He looked at their joined hands and then at her face, and what was in his expression then was not performance and not calculation, and not the careful management of emotion. It was simply the genuine, open, slightly undone look of a man who had wanted something for a long time and had not entirely allowed himself to believe he would have it. He brought her hand up and held it against his chest, over his heart, and she could feel it beating there steady and strong and real. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "with your permission." "You have it," she said. The courtship of Mary Bell and Edgar Langston in the winter and early spring of 1879 was, by the standards of Millhaven County, a very open secret. Edgar came to the Bell farm 3 or 4 times a week and stayed for meals when invited, which was most of the time. He drove Mary and the children to the Sunday service in Millhaven in his wagon, which was exactly the kind of visible, public act that communicated intention in the social language of a small western town. People noticed. People talked, because people always talk, but most of what they said was, in fact, not unkind. Edgar Langston was known and respected, and Mary Bell had earned a great deal of quiet admiration in the past year, and the general sense of Millhaven was that this was a reasonable and decent development. Mrs. Hayward told Mary directly over a cup of tea that Edgar was exactly the right kind of man and that she should not be foolish. Mary said she was not in the habit of being foolish, and Mrs. Hayward said that all women are occasionally foolish about men. It is one of the few remaining equal opportunities, and Mary laughed, which she was doing more frequently than she had in a year. Daniel approved of Edgar with the same blunt certainty he had expressed from the beginning, and he demonstrated this approval by following Edgar everywhere on his farm visits and absorbing information about cattle operations with the intensity of a boy who had decided on his life's profession before age 9. Clara, whose approval was always instantaneous and unconditional, and based on the instinctive measurement of essential character that small children perform, had decided Edgar was hers to an extent that occasionally required her mother to gently remind her of the boundaries of ownership. February brought the first calves, not Absalom's, which would come in summer, but 2 calves from the older cows that had already been in calf when Mary purchased the farm. It was an unexpected but genuine gift of timing, and Mary was up 2 nights running managing the births with the competence she had developed over the past year, and in the morning when she told Edgar about the calves, his face did something wonderful, pure, uncomplicated gladness for her, not pride in his own contributions but gladness at her success. She loved him for it. She knew it clearly by then, and she stopped being surprised by it. Love had come differently the second time. Not with the sweet, uncomplicated rush of being 17 and new to everything, but with the particular quality of something known, something you could hold up to the light and examine from all sides and find genuine and good and worth choosing with your whole self, rather than just the part that is young and unafraid. The sale of the 2 older cows, negotiated through Edgar's contacts and completed in February, brought in enough to make a significant payment on the bank loan, and when she brought the payment to Gerald Hooper in person, accompanied by a careful written account of her current and projected stock numbers, she watched him absorb the information with the tightly controlled frustration of a man whose plans have been inconveniently disrupted. "The operation appears to be progressing," he said. "It is," Mary said pleasantly. She walked out of the bank into the thin February sunshine and felt the particular satisfaction of a battle won not through luck, but through determination and careful work, and the willingness to accept help when it was offered by someone worth accepting it from. The spring in Colorado that year arrived with the drama it typically reserved for years that had been particularly hard, sudden, vivid, almost violent in its color and warmth, as though the land was making a point. The creek came up with the snowmelt, and the grass came green faster than anyone expected. And by April, the Bell Farm's south pasture was lush in a way that made Absalom, finally, seem genuinely content, which Mary took as a good omen. Edgar asked her to marry him on an April evening when the sun was still an hour from setting, and they were sitting on the porch steps of her farmhouse watching Daniel and Clara run circles in the yard with the reckless energy of children who have been cooped up through a long winter. He did not make it into a production. He was not, by nature, a man who made productions of things, which was one of the reasons she loved him. He simply said, sitting beside her on the step with his arm warm against hers, "Mary, I would like you to marry me. I would like to spend my life on this land with you and your children and whatever comes after, if you'll have me." She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "Edgar, yes." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into his side, and they sat like that for a while, watching the children play in the spring evening. And it was one of the most complete moments she had experienced, not because it was dramatic, but because it was exactly, precisely right. They told the children together. Daniel's response was to ask with immediate practicality whether Edgar would now be bringing his horses to their farm, because Colonel could use the company. Clara's response was to throw both arms around Edgar's neck and say, "I knew it," with the smug certainty of someone who considers themselves to have been the primary architect of the arrangement, which, in fairness, was not entirely incorrect. They were married in June, in the small Methodist church in Millhaven, in a ceremony that was modest and genuine, and exactly what both of them wanted. The church was attended by most of the town. Millhaven turned out for weddings as it turned out for funerals, with the complete participation of a community that understood itself as a shared entity. Mrs. Hayward sat in the front row and dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Pete Calloway, who had sent Mary to the auction in the first place, and privately considered himself entirely responsible for this outcome, shook Edgar's hand with the pride of a man accepting credit he had not quite earned but genuinely deserved. Mary wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had made herself from fabric sent by her sister in Tennessee. It was not white, because she had been married before and she was 31 years old, and she had no interest in pretending to be something she wasn't. She wore her mother's garnet brooch at the collar. She looked, by the account of everyone present, absolutely beautiful, and the expression on Edgar Langston's face when she walked down the aisle confirmed this assessment beyond any statistical doubt. Edgar wore his best coat, which he had bought new for the occasion from the dry goods store, dark wool, well cut, the kind of coat that said a man was taking the day seriously. He had shaved. He stood at the front of the church with the patient steadiness that was fundamental to his character, and when Mary reached him and they looked at each other in the candlelight, something passed between them that was private and profound and would not have been improved by any additional drama. The minister said the words, and they said their words in return, clearly and with certainty, and then they were married. The reception was held in the churchyard while the June evening stayed warm, with tables of food that half the women of Millhaven had contributed, and a fiddle player named Garrett who had 3 styles of playing fast, faster, and dangerously fast, and who provided music that caused even Edgar, who had never been described as a dancing man, to take Mary's hand and move through 2 dances with an unsuspected naturalness that made her laugh with delight. She danced. She actually danced, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and it was not something she had expected to do on this side of grief. But here she was 31 years old and married again and dancing in the June churchyard, while the mountains stood purple in the evening light, and her children ran between the tables eating cake, and her new husband's hand was warm and certain in hers. The summer of 1879 was the summer everything that had been planted began to grow in earnest. Absalom's calves began arriving in July, as expected 8 in total from the 6 cows, strong and healthy, a number that made even Gerald Hooper's arithmetic bend in a favorable direction. Edgar and Mary between them managed the Langston flat and the Bell farm, which they had decided to run as a single combined operation. The farms were separated by 4 miles, but the operational logic of combining them was undeniable, and Edgar moved his ranch hands Amos and Pete Gruber to divide their time between both properties. The decision about where to live as a family was made with the same practical honesty that characterized how they made most decisions. The Bell farmhouse was smaller but had the better grazing land and the creek access that Hooper had coveted. The Langston flat house was larger and more established. They would winter at Langston Flat, where the house was better suited to a family, and keep the Bell land actively worked through all seasons. Mary went to the bank in August with Edgar beside her. His presence was her choice, not his insistence, and Hooper understood immediately that the equation had changed. She presented the summer's numbers, which were genuinely strong, and made a substantial payment on the loan. And she did it calmly and directly, and with the absolute certainty of a woman who knew exactly where she stood. Hooper accepted the payment and the documentation with a thinly veiled dissatisfaction that he was professional enough not to express directly, and Mary rode home from Millhaven in Edgar's wagon in the summer afternoon, and felt something she could only describe as freedom. Not the absence of difficulty, because difficulty was a permanent resident of ranch life in 1879 Colorado, but freedom from the specific, crushing pressure of uncertainty that had been her constant companion for the past year. "He'll find another farm," Edgar said, meaning Hooper. "Yes," Mary said, "he will, but not ours." Edgar took her hand on the wagon bench, and she laced her fingers through his, and they drove home through the summer golden high plains country with the Rockies enormous and beautiful in the west, and it was very good. The autumn brought the kind of work that ranch operations in Colorado always demanded, the push to prepare for winter, to ensure the stock was in good condition, to assess the year's gains and plan the next year's operations. Edgar and Mary worked side by side in the natural, easy partnership of 2 people whose approaches to problems are genuinely compatible, which is a rarer thing than it sounds. They argued sometimes, because both of them had opinions and neither was inclined to suppress them, but they argued cleanly without cruelty, without performance, working toward resolution rather than victory. Daniel, who had started taking on real responsibilities around the operation with the seriousness of a boy growing up faster than might have been ideal but doing it well, had become Edgar's dedicated student in all things cattle-related, and Edgar taught him with the patience of someone who genuinely believed that teaching a thing well was as important as knowing it. Clara continued to manage the household's emotional temperature with 5-year-old authority, and had recently made a formal declaration that she wanted a baby sister, which she announced at the supper table with the same certainty with which she had announced most of her major positions. Mary and Edgar had looked at each other across the table, and Edgar's expression had been one of careful neutrality that was doing an insufficient job of concealing something warmer, and Mary had said, "Clara, that is not something that can be ordered like a dress from the catalog." And Edgar had said, "In general terms, though, it is not necessarily an impossibility," and Mary had thrown her dinner napkin at him, which made Daniel inhale his water and Clara dissolve into laughter. And it had been one of those ordinary, perfect evenings. It was not a baby sister who arrived the following spring. In the spring of 1880, Mary Bell Langston, age 32, gave birth to a son. They named him Thomas Edgar Langston Thomas for the man who had come first and loved her, and given her Daniel and Clara, and 40 acres of rocky Colorado soil, and Edgar for the man who sat outside the bedroom door for 8 hours in the most difficult patience of his life, and came inside when the midwife told him he could, and looked at the infant in Mary's arms with an expression of such raw, genuine awe that Mary had to look away for a moment to compose herself. Thomas Edgar, Edgar said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed and touching the baby's hand with one careful finger. Yes, Mary said. He looked up at her and she saw clearly what she already knew, that he understood why she had chosen that name, and that it was right, and that he loved her for it. "Hello, Thomas," Edgar said to his son, in the quiet, certain voice of a man who has found what he was looking for. The boy was healthy and loud and had, from the first day, Edgar's straight brow and Mary's gray-green eyes, and he was immediately worshipped by his older siblings in ways that forecast a great deal of exhausting coalition against parental authority in the years ahead. Millhaven in 1880 was changing, as all western towns were changing. The railroad was pushing closer, the population was growing, the wild and uncertain quality of the frontier was beginning to settle into something more institutionalized. The land questions that had been raw in 1878 were in some ways resolving, though not always justly. The pressure on the Ute and Arapaho peoples who had long called this land home continued with the relentless logic of expansion, and Edgar and Mary both saw it and knew what it meant even if the people in the comfortable Eastern newspapers did not, and they felt the weight of that injustice even while they built their own lives on the same contested land. These were not easy thoughts, and they did not simplify them or look away from them, but they were also not fully able to stop what forces of history had already set in motion around and before them. What they could do, and did, was treat the people they encountered with the respect and honest dealing that they tried to extend to everyone, which was insufficient but was real. Gerald Hooper made one more appearance in Mary's life, in the summer of 1880. When he came to the Langston flat with an offer on the Bell Creek land that was formally very reasonable and practically very revealing. He presented it to both Edgar and Mary, and Edgar let Mary respond, because he understood without being told that this was hers to handle. Mary heard the offer in its entirety and then said, "Mr. Hooper, that land belonged to my first husband and it will belong to my children. It is not for sale at any price. I believe we have made that clear on at least one previous occasion." Hooper left and Mary and Edgar watched his buggy move down the road from the porch of the Langston flat, and Edgar said, "Do you think he'll keep trying?" "For a while," Mary said, "and then he'll find someone else to try it on." She was right. By the following year, Hooper had turned his attention to land farther north, near the new railroad route, where the prospects were larger and the widows apparently more persuadable. Mary heard about it through Pete Calloway and felt nothing so complicated as satisfaction, just the clean, complete sense of a thing that was finished. The Langston operation continued to grow through the early 1880s with the steady, building logic of good management and genuine labor. By 1882, they were running close to 500 head between the two properties, with Amos and Pete Gruber supplemented by 2 additional hands and a full-time barn manager. The Bell Farm, Mary refused to stop calling it that, and Edgar never once suggested she should produce calves every year from stock that traced its lineage directly back to one ornery Hereford bull purchased at auction for a single silver dollar. Absalom himself lived to a remarkable age for a working bull, which Mary took as a commentary on the character of creatures who maintain strong opinions about their own importance. He became, over the years, something between a mascot and a legend on the property too old for his original purpose after his 7th year in the pasture, but kept on in honorable retirement because Mary would not hear of any other arrangement. Edgar, who could calculate the economics of keeping a non-productive bull with absolute clarity, never once raised a practical objection to this, which said a very great deal about the kind of man he was. In the winter of 1882, Mary's sister from Tennessee came to visit. The first family visit Mary had had since before Thomas died, and the first time anyone from her previous life had met Edgar. The sister, whose name was Ruth, arrived with a trunk full of opinions and a watchfulness that was entirely sisterly, and she spent the first 2 days of her visit observing Edgar with the critical intensity of someone who loves her sister and intends to form a complete assessment. On the third evening, while Edgar was in the barn with Daniel attending to some matter of horsemanship that Daniel had declared urgent, Ruth sat down with Mary in the Langston flat kitchen and said, "He's extraordinary." Mary looked up from her mending. "I know," she said simply. "He looks at you like," Ruth paused, searching for the right description, "like you're the first good thing he ever decided to let himself have." Mary set down her mending and looked at her sister and thought about the auction yard in the autumn of 1878, about a wagon ride through the cold Colorado afternoon, about a man who drove 6 miles out of his way and never mentioned it, about Christmas and coffee and fence posts, and the kitchen table and a silver dollar and a stubborn bull. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." The winter of 1883 brought another baby. Clara's long-advocated campaign for a sister was finally answered by a daughter they named Ruth Alice Langston, after Mary's sister and after Edgar's mother. And Ruth declared herself personally vindicated, and Clara declared herself personally triumphant, and the baby demonstrated no particular opinion on the matter, being engaged primarily with the business of existing. Thomas, now 3 years old, found the new development interesting for approximately 2 days before returning his attention to the more pressing question of whether he could convince Daniel to let him ride the smallest horse. The Langston flat in the winter of 1883 was a full house in every sense, 4 children ranging from 3 to 13, a working ranch, 2 properties to manage, and 2 people who had found their way to each other through a specific set of unlikely and difficult circumstances, and had built something genuinely solid from those materials. There were hard years, because ranch life in Colorado always included hard years. A drought year when the pastures burned brown by August, a winter when the creek froze to a depth that damaged the infrastructure they'd built along it, a year when cattle prices dropped so severely that half the county's operators ran into crisis. Through each of these things, Edgar and Mary navigated with the particular combination of practicality and partnership that they had established from the beginning. They argued about the right responses, listened to each other, made decisions together, and then implemented those decisions as a team. Their arguments, witnessed by their children and occasionally by Pete Calloway and Mrs. Hayward and others who came through the farm, were famous in a small local way for their specificity and their resolution. Mary and Edgar Bell Langston did not fight about feelings or about who was right in some general cosmic sense. They fought about fence post placement and cattle pricing, and whether it was worth the investment to add a second barn or simply expand the existing structure. These arguments always ended in a decision, and then dinner, because they were practical people. Daniel, now grown to 15 and 16 and beyond, was turning into an extraordinary young ranch hand under Edgar's tutelage, with an instinct for cattle that seemed almost inherited, as though the land and the work had become part of his blood in the years since his mother had walked into an auction yard with $1 and changed all their lives. He had Thomas's eyes and Mary's determination, and something that was entirely his own, a steady, observant quality that would serve him very well. Clara at 12 was her mother in miniature, practical and warm and unafraid of saying exactly what she thought, which continued to be, consistently, a great deal. Ruth Alice at 3 was an investigation of the universe in small boots. On a September evening in 1884, 6 years from the day Mary Bell had walked into the Millhaven cattle auction with 1 coin and left with a bull and a man she hadn't bargained for, Mary and Edgar sat on the porch of the Langston flat in the last warmth of the summer evening and watched the sun make its particular, magnificent production of descending behind the Rockies, all gold and rose and the deepest imaginable blue spreading up from the mountain peaks. The children were inside. The operation was strong. The bank loan on the Bell farm had been paid off entirely 2 years ago, in a transaction that Mary had completed alone in Hooper's office, while he wore a different cravat, green this time, and accepted the final payment with the professional grace of a man who had learned that some battles were not worth maintaining. The cattle in the south pasture moved slow and settled in the evening light, and somewhere among them, in honorable retirement, Absalom stood and surveyed his world with the magnificent indifference that had defined him since the beginning. Edgar reached over and took Mary's hand where it rested on the arm of her chair. She turned her hand over and held his, as she had in the kitchen that January morning when everything had changed. "I've been thinking," Edgar said, in the particular tone that meant he had been thinking about something for a while and was now ready to share it. "Tell me," she said. "I want to build a new barn on the Bell property," he said. "A real one, large enough for the expanded herd numbers we're projecting for next year, with proper ventilation and a good hay loft." It would mean taking on a construction crew for the summer. Mary considered this. The timber cost would be significant. Yes. But the alternative is continuing to patch what's there, which isn't going to hold another 5 years. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She looked out at the mountains, running the numbers in her head with the ease of someone who had been doing ranch arithmetic for 6 years. "Spring," she said. "Do it in spring when we have the cash flow from the winter sales." "That's what I was thinking," he said. A silence, the comfortable kind. The evening birds were settling somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. "Edgar," she said, "yes. Do you know what I was thinking about today? Tell me." "The auction," she said, "that morning in 1878. I walked in with $1 and I genuinely thought that I was the most foolish woman in Colorado." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you were the most remarkable thing I had seen in years," he said. "Standing there at the rail with your chin up, bidding on a bull nobody wanted." She laughed softly. "I was terrified." "I know, you didn't show it." "I showed it a little," she said. "My hand wasn't entirely steady when I paid." "I saw that," he admitted. "It made me—" He paused, and she heard something in the pause that was still, after 6 years, slightly unguarded. "I wanted to help you. I wanted to take that worry off you so badly it surprised me, because I'd just met you." She turned her head to look at him in the evening light, and he was looking back at her with that direct, honest quality that had never changed, not in 6 years of marriage and difficulty and joy and ordinary Tuesday evenings and extraordinary September ones. "Edgar Langston," she said, "I have thought about it many times, and I cannot identify a single thing I would change." He brought her hand up to his lips, the way he had learned she liked, and never made a production of, just a brief, certain press of his mouth against her knuckles, a gesture that said everything it said in its restraint as much as in its offering. "Neither can I," he said. Inside the house, something crashed, likely Thomas, who at 4 was conducting a permanent survey of the limits of acceptable domestic physics, and a moment later Clara's authoritative voice could be heard explaining the situation to someone, and Ruth Alice's laughter rose like a small bright sound above it all, and Daniel's patient older brother intervention could be heard beginning to organize the situation back toward order. Mary and Edgar looked at each other. They went inside together. The Bell farm, now the Bell Langston operation, continued to grow through the latter years of the 1880s with the steady momentum of something well-built and well-tended. The new barn went up in the spring of 1885, exactly as planned, and it stood on the Bell land like a declaration, tall and solid and red against the Colorado sky, big enough for the herd they had now and the herd they were building toward. Mary stood and looked at it the day the construction crew finished and felt something she recognized as pride, the specific, earned kind. Daniel Bell, at 17, was effectively running the Bell farm operation as a junior partner, and Edgar treated him exactly as that, with the respect owed to genuine competence, which Daniel had in abundance. Edgar had taught him what he knew, and Daniel had absorbed it and added his own instincts, and the combination was formidable. Mary watched her older son become a man with the particular bittersweet quality of a mother who has done her job well enough that the result no longer needs her in the ways he once did. Clara, at 15, had decided she wanted to be a schoolteacher, which surprised no one who had ever watched her explain things to anyone who would hold still long enough. She rode into Millhaven 3 times a week to attend the school there, which had expanded with the town's growth, and she approached her education with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. Thomas Edgar, at 5, had Edgar's temperament and Mary's vocabulary, and was the most exhausting and delightful child on the property, which was saying something given the competition. He had decided his primary purpose was to learn everything about horses, and Edgar accommodated this with the patience of a man who recognized his own reflection in certain kinds of determination. Ruth Alice, at 2, was a round, emphatic, joyful person who had attached herself to Daniel with the devotion of a youngest child for the oldest sibling, and followed him everywhere with her short legs working hard to keep pace with his long ones. And Daniel, who had been 8 years old when his world changed at an auction yard, and had grown up honest and steady in the wake of that change, carried her on his shoulders without complaint and pointed out the things she wanted to see. It was in the autumn of 1885, on a day when the aspens were gold again along the creek line the way they had been gold that first October afternoon on a wagon bench, that Mary Belle Langston stood in the kitchen of the Langston flat house and looked around at the life she had built, not alone, not all at once, not without grief and difficulty and a single silver dollar spent at the outer edge of hope, and felt the complete, encompassing fullness of it. Edgar came in from the barn while she was standing there, stopped when he saw her expression and said, "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly all right," she said, and meant it in the deepest, most specific way. He crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against his chest, and they stood together in the kitchen of their house in the Colorado autumn of 1885, while outside the aspens turned, and the mountains stood, and the cattle moved slow and unhurried in the pastures, and Absalom, who had no particular interest in anyone's narrative, continued to survey his retirement with appropriate dignity. The years after were full in the way that good years are full, with the weight of living rather than the weight of surviving. They expanded the operation. They watched their children grow. They buried old Colonel the plow horse with a ceremony that Thomas, aged 6, insisted upon, and that required both Edgar and Mary to keep their expressions very serious through the eulogy Daniel delivered with all appropriate gravity. They attended Clara's teaching certification ceremony in Pueblo with the pride of people who know they had something to do with the person standing at the front of the room, though not as much as the person standing at the front of the room had to do with herself. They built a 3rd bedroom onto the Langston flat house, when it became clear that the existing configuration required geometrical creativity from the children. They hired 2 more ranch hands and promoted Amos Gruber, who had been with them since the beginning, to full foreman of the combined operation at a wage that recognized both his competence and his loyalty. Amos Gruber, who was a man of few words and extremely practical sensibilities, accepted this with a nod and went back to work, which was how Edgar had always expected it to go and why he trusted Amos in the first place. Pete Calloway, who had sent a widow to a cattle auction with the advice that sometimes a dollar could find its purpose, remained the closest thing either of them had to a town grandfather, a presence at every significant moment of the family's life, at Christmas dinners and birthday celebrations, and the occasional Sunday after church when he would come out to the farm and sit on the porch and tell stories about the old days with the liberty of a man who is old enough that no one can verify the details. Absalom died in the spring of 1886, which was a more significant occasion than a purely rational accounting of the situation would suggest. He had been, by the end, 20-something years old, older than any bull had a right to be, Edgar said, and Mary said that Absalom had not been the kind of bull who consulted other people's rights. They found him in the south pasture one morning, which was where he had always been, and he had the particular quality of something that has simply stopped rather than failed. Mary stood at the fence of the south pasture for a long time that morning, her hands on the worn wood, thinking about $1 and an auction yard, and everything that had come from the moment she had said one bid into a silence full of men who thought she was foolish. She was not crying, but she was feeling everything very clearly and without editing. Edgar stood beside her, not saying anything, because he knew when things needed to be said and when they needed to be stood beside, and he had always known the difference. He was worth every penny, Mary said finally. Yes, Edgar said. He was. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and between them was 6 years of marriage and 4 children and 500 head of cattle and a barn and a paid-off loan, and a life that was not the one she had planned and was better for it in every way that mattered. Edgar, she said. Yes, he said, as he always did. I love you, she said plainly, in the direct way she had always said things she meant. He put his arm around her shoulders and pulled her against his side, and she felt him press a kiss to the top of her head, certain and unhurried and entirely his. I love you, Mary, he said. I have since you stood in that auction yard and bid $1 on a bull nobody wanted and refused to let anyone see you were afraid. She leaned into him and looked out over the south pasture, which was going to need a new tenant now, another project, another negotiation with the catalog of what was possible and what was necessary, another chapter in the ongoing, alive, demanding, beautiful work of building something real on the high Colorado plains. She was not afraid. She had not been afraid, not truly, since the day a man with honest dark eyes had driven 6 miles out of his way to give her a ride home and asked for nothing in return. The mountains were enormous on the western horizon, and the spring was in the air, and below them the pasture grass was coming green through what was left of winter. And somewhere in the house she could hear Thomas arguing with Ruth Alice about something that required immediate adult intervention, and Edgar's arm was warm and steady around her shoulders, and all of it, every complicated, imperfect, entirely real piece of it, was hers. She straightened up, patted Edgar's arm once in the practical, affectionate way she had of ending tender moments before they became too large for the day, and said, We should look at the spring catalog for bull options. We'll need someone new in that south pasture before summer. Edgar's expression moved through something warm and then settled back into the companionable practicality that was their shared native language. I'll ride into Millhaven tomorrow, he said. Pete might have heard if anyone's bringing stock to the May auction. Good, Mary said, and they walked back to the house together, side by side, through the Colorado spring morning to everything that was waiting for them.